Hello and welcome to Warwick Business School's Core Insights podcast with me, Audrey Dias. Today's topic, I'm sure, is on the minds of most business leaders, and that is the post-COVID economic recovery, both globally and here in the UK. Now, my guests are Ana Galvao, Professor of Economic Modelling and Forecasting at Warwick Business School, and Paul Fisher, who is a former member of the Bank of England's Monetary Policy Committee and a visiting professor at the Business School. Thank you both for joining us. So, Ana, if I can start with you. At the end of last year, you wrote a paper which said that figuring out when the UK economy would be back to its pre-crisis levels was grotesquely difficult. Now, is that still the case, or has the picture got any clearer?
Economic forecasting normally is done based on how things have happened in the past and how we can use that to project in the future. So one of the main difficulties in trying to predict the recovery effects on GDP growth is to find any irregularity in the data. So what happened in 2020 when the COVID recession started is that most of the models we used to use for forecasting based on past data, they just couldn't cope because they didn't have enough information in the data to try to figure out the impact of the recession. Now, when you try to move out of the recessions, the models have similar kind of difficulties and additional difficulty, which is the fact that if you look at the data from last year, from March, April, May last year, it's completely unusual. So it's completely different from what happened from the last 200 years, which means that some of these models fail because the data is quite different from what they had before. Another issue as well that the models find difficulties in grasp what's going on with the economy is issues with the fact that normally when you forecast, you want to have a notion about how uncertain you are about the future. And if you try to treat this data as some kind of outlier data, that means that they have no impact on the uncertainty you have about the future. And this is a very difficult statement to do. So what happened was that the people that used to use loads of statistical models tried to adapt the models as much as possible. And actually experts that did forecasts using their own judgment by basically, looking at additional source of data, they did much better. So there being a big development now in looking at different data sources, different measures of activities that we didn't use to look at before, such that we can improve our forecasts for the recovery. That said, most of the people, when think about in forecasting recovery, if you look at institutions like the IMF, what they have in mind is a bit of how the economic relations work. So they know if the economy normally moves at the potential. So if you went down the potential because of the COVID shock, then normally when you come back, it can come back faster because you can't just use the capacity that hasn't been used before. So in that sense, that's why most of the forecasts is actually predicting very strong growth for 2021. It have that in mind. So it's not something based on past historical data. It's just this notion about how the facts that there's loads of extra capacity out there could be replaced. That said, there's of course issues because in some sectors the recovery is going on, and some other sectors that have been still affected by restrictions coming from the pandemic, this recovery is lower than others. So my summary on my research is that I think it was key to use judgment in forecasting to see the impact of the COVID effects on the economy. Is also key to use now for the recovery because some of the models cannot cope with that kind of changes. But at the same time, there have been loads of research in adapting the models to the changes, including methods using some very sophisticated machine learning and some ultra high frequency new data sets.
I mean, do you agree with that, Paul? So do you believe that picture could now get clearer?
Yeah, in some ways, it's an interesting question. If you're an individual working in, say, a pub or a shop, you want to know when are things going to get back to the way they were before the crisis. And at that level, it's a very relevant question. If you're looking at it from the point of view of the economy as a whole, I'm not sure that getting back to where we were is the right question to be looking at, because the structure of the economy has fundamentally changed in certain aspects. I mean, tourism, I suspect now to be running at a very low level, but it was 10% of the UK economy before the crisis. And it's not going to recover to being 10% anytime soon. The airline industry is not going to recover to the same levels of activity before, whereas other parts of industry are growing much faster. So we've had this structural break in the economic system, and then comparing the before and after isn't necessarily even a valid thing to do, even if it's very relevant for an individual who is trying to get back to a normal way of life. But my main comment would be people are very ingenious and flexible and tend to find a way. And so we've seen people move industries from, say, entertainment into health, or we've seen people that used to be just restaurants serving takeaway food. And so I think the economy will find its own way back as quickly as it can, because people will be desperate to work and get some income in. But what we've got less idea about is what that sort of economy will look like in its structure because of the major shock that's happened.
What should banks and central governments be doing to achieve recovery then, Paul?
Well, I think what they were trying to do last year was the right thing, which was to keep businesses going. There were a lot of businesses which were on the brink, as there always are before the crisis struck. They probably had gone. We saw one or two big, well-known failures. But a lot of other businesses would have been quite good, sustainable, long-term businesses that would have had a sudden loss of income. And trying to keep those businesses going through the pandemic until demand for their products comes back was the right thing to do. Now, whether that justifies the particular way that policies such as the furlough scheme or other sort of subsidies to businesses work, whether they were exactly the right things to do or not is another matter. But the general thrust of trying to keep businesses going and keep people in employment until the pandemic was fizzling out, that was the right approach. But after that, the main thing is to do no harm, really, and not get in the way of the recovery. I think central banks have got very little to do in this sort of situation. Principally, monetary policy works through short-term demand management. And you've got to be very careful with that we don't simply stoke up potential inflation later down the road, because the monetary policy stimulus can't really work during the pandemic when shops are closed or only partially open, or the factories are working short time. And what we will see is a bit of a rush through from some of those policies at some point. The central banks really just need to keep care to balance the economy out. But the main thing will be, I think, letting the economy develop back the way it feels is best.
So, Anna, what do you think of that?
I agree with Paul that the policies implemented to fight the issues of the impact of the pandemic in the economy was to sustain employment. And of course, these are relevant policies. I also agree with the issue that the impact that COVID have on the economy, and of course that might lead some structural changes in the economy with possible long-run consequences.
Anna, again, there is no doubt that COVID will have had an impact on the economy, but will growth be scarred in the long term by the pandemic?
The long-term impact of the pandemic will depend, of course, on whether the changes we're seeing now in terms of sectors recovering fast than others generate some kind of structural change in the economy. But it might not be the case. So, for example, if you move for sectors that are actually more productive, it might be that the things getting better in the future. But what I agree with Paul is this notion that the initial notion is that the COVID recession will be very short. And as a consequence, the economy could bounce very fast. And as a consequence, we have very limited long-term squaring. But because we're seeing all this evidence that the different sectors have been affected different due to the restrictions of the pandemic, like airlines and hospitality. So it might be that this has long-run consequences. Now, whether that would mean that long-run growth on average will be lower or higher over time, that bit I still cannot say, because we normally think that long-run growth is related with productivity, right? So it might be that the change of weight in the economy across sector make the economy more productive, which means more growth in the future.
Paul, do you believe there are any countries that seem to be coping better than others with the economic challenges of the pandemic?
I think it's easier to see the countries that are coping less well. Clearly, if you depend on international trade, if you depend on lots of tourism and things like that, you're going to suffer more. But it's very difficult to do cross-country comparisons at the moment when we don't even know if the COVID statistics are at all comparable across countries. I think every country has suffered. UK being a relatively open economy is always going to suffer a bit more because of that. But it's I think it'll be some time before we can really assess what the effect of COVID is. The structure of the economy will be different. Growth is really determined, as Anna says, by the supply side of the economy. And for me, things like how we adapt to climate change and make our economies more sustainable is going to be a much bigger feature of our growth rate going forward than the effect of the pandemic. But over the last year, you have seen people reflect a lot on the way our economy is structured. And we could see some permanent changes. So, for example, we could be looking at people sourcing more consumer goods from their own country, from their own localities, rather than having things imported vast distances across country. We could see businesses traveling a lot less and using video technology a lot more. And some of these things will change the way that countries operate. And for some that will be good, for some that will be bad. And it's very, very difficult at the moment to see exactly how that's going to pan out.
Yeah, okay. So it will be a while before we understand the effects of the pandemic. But Anna, I mean, here in the UK, there is that deadly mix of the pandemic and Brexit. Do you think that's going to have an impact on economic growth?
So the impact, the current short-term effect of things like Brexit and COVID is related with issues like putting pressures on prices, right? So some of the barriers for trade that came after Brexit have increased the costs of some products that are being imported, and also some difficulty for exporting. And that tends to put a cost effects on the firms in the UK, and may put some kind of inflationary pressure. So this is the short-run effect. I mean, the long-run effect of Brexit, of course, is the issues that trade can have on, in particular, some sectors of the economy that rely a lot on imported goods and use a lot of markets outside the UK. Because although there was a trade deal, there is still some known tariff barriers that are creating additional costs for trading. And again, in terms of long-term growth for the economy, that kind of competitiveness of the UK economy abroad and being able to source imported goods is normally important for the economy. So the Brexit can still have some negative effects in that sense because of these kind of barriers. At the same time, as we discussed earlier, we're being quite optimistic with this notion that might which is the change across different sectors in the economy, and maybe reweighting these sectors. And as Paul was saying, it might be that would lead support for growth in some areas that before were not there in the UK economy.
So what do you think of that, Paul? The pandemic and Brexit, a deadly mix for the UK?
I think the main impact of Brexit so far was to bring forward a big fall in the exchange rate. Which was probably necessary given the UK's net trade position. But it basically makes the UK worse off in the short run because imports are more expensive, and that includes things like foreign holidays. That's an imported good in the UK, whereas it makes our goods cheaper. Now, we might have hoped over time that fall in the exchange rate would lead to more exports abroad. And I think the effect of the pandemic limiting international trade may mean that we don't see that bounce back in international trade anytime soon. But it's quite complicated. I mean, if you take the EU, famously, they used to export more to us than we did to them. So we're yet to see what the trade effects come out. But we're certainly not going to get as quickly any of the benefits on trade with the rest of the world that some people would have expected to have seen from Brexit. I mean, they were always contentious, but it's going to be a lot harder to see them come through now.
Anna, I know you've said it time and time again, and so have you, Paul, that we can't really predict what is going to happen in the future. But what can be done now? What you believe are the factors that could help influence a steady economic growth? Anna, if you can start.
Our issue now is that we've been like for 1 or 2 years of very loose monetary policy all over the advanced economies. And now the pressure I was talking before about pressure on inflation is something also related to the very large increase in oil prices is being spread around in the UK, Euro area, and the United States. Now, most of the central bankers are still, letting the monetary policy being loose, but one of the main concerns is when they start putting maybe interest rates up and which kind of impact that would have in terms of constraining for the recovery, and also which kind of spillover that would have to other countries in the world. And that might be a bit problematic. So the timing of the shift in the monetary policy regime, I think it is a crucial point here, and it's going to be very hard to balance. Other thing that's probably going to be very hard to balance is that, of course, what the support measures done, like the furlough schemes and all the schemes done in the advanced economy to support jobs, were very costly, which means that the governments are run very large public deficits. And the question is, this somehow in the long run has to be rebalanced. So the question is when you're going to start rebalancing and get the right timing to not scare too much the recovery. So in theory, we should expect, of course, with all these sectoral adjustments that since there is lots of capacity in the economy, the recovery could be really very fast, and you potentially could go back as soon as these issues, the policies of lockdown and constraint of movement are removed. But at the same time, it is very hard for policymakers to judge when we move also the support being given during this period.
What about you, Paul? What do you think?
The real issue here is not to get too hung up on the short term. I think we have seen something more reflection on what does a sustainable economy look like. And I think we should think about that more going forward and not worry too much about the short-term path of the economy. We do need to continue with the policies towards transition to net zero carbon emissions. That's probably the most important thing for the UK. Now we have great opportunities to do that. And I think the fact that the pandemic causes some short-term fluctuations, that will need careful management. I expect the Bank of England to be very careful in the way it responds. But actually, if we ended up with a little bit of inflation and somewhat higher interest rates, that wouldn't be a bad thing. The trick with that is how do you make it only a little bit of inflation and only somewhat higher interest rates? Because if interest rates were jacked up very sharply, that would put a lot of people with large debts very quickly into a negative position and you risk causing a shock. So we need to be very careful. But the real issue here is how do we get the supply side of the economy working properly to have a sustainable future? And we've learned quite a lot during the crisis about how much is imported around the world, what sort of risk we're taking. And we need to bear a lot of these longer term considerations in mind when we come to manage the economy out of where we are now.
Now, there are certain sectors of the economy. I know you mentioned that, Paul, you mentioned tourism, and then there is hospitality. Some of them have taken a massive hit during this pandemic. Do you see them bouncing back? I know you mentioned, yes, it's all about thinking, not necessarily thinking long term, but I mean, do we see these recovering?
I think some of the changes will be permanent. I think people will be traveling less. And some of that will be changes yet to come. For example, at the moment, we still actually subsidise international air travel because we don't charge duty on jet fuel. Okay, and that's got to change. And I think changes like that will mean that some of these sectors change. The economy is never about a static economy which just miraculously grows. The economy is always churning. Industries are coming in, industries are going out, and that's even the case when you don't have something like a pandemic come along. And it's going; those sorts of changes are going to be accelerated by the pandemic. So I don't think we should necessarily expect things to remain the same. A lot of pubs were closing down before the pandemic, and if anything, turning more into restaurants. I would expect that to continue and perhaps to be accelerated. A lot of people were trying to cut down office space and thinking about how to use new technology to change their workplaces. I think that will accelerate. And so I think what we'll see is quite a lot of structural change in the economy being pushed forward as a result of the pandemic, rather than just seeing things recover to the way they were before.
Well, in that sense, I think you're right in the sense that, we have this notion that maybe travel abroad too much had consequences for the environment. But of course, after this year or so in which you travel much less, it might be that this change is now time to come, right? Because before, it was so much travel around. So I think you have a point there that it might be that there'll be some changes in preferences of consumers that go to hospitality services and the travel industry that may be permanent.
Now, we like to close these podcasts by asking you both to come up with some recommendations for further reading on this topic. Anna, if I can start with you.
So if you see the last comments on things like on how big institutions are changing the forecasts about what they think are going to be with the economy, like with the cover, like for example, the IMF and the OECD just published update forecasts on their views. And it's interesting reading in the sense that their decisions are related with, how they think the vaccine is going to affect, the countries, and if they're able to really stop using lockdowns to contain the advance of the virus, and in that sense, open up for economic activities. And at the same time, they have this in mind on the story I told you before, that when you push the economy down, it should come back up fast. And they're just trying to distribute the recovery across the last year, knowing how far you are from the potential at the moment for the different economies. So this is the kind of evidence we would advise is looking at OECD and IMF reports on what their views about the recovery. And actually, if you're unable to look at historical views, you can see how they've changed their minds. So you can see how economic forecasters now and then change their views because of things have happened that they have to.
What about you, Paul? Any recommendations for our listeners?
Well, the obvious sources, really, the Bank of England's inflation report and forecasts always contain a great deal more than is reported in the media. And so they're always worth looking through to find some hidden gems of analysis. And what you'll tend to find is they look much more at the possibilities of the outcomes, not just at a single central case. The newspapers love to report whatever the central projection is, when actually what the policymakers should be looking at, and the Bank of England does look at, is a variety of different possibilities depending on how things shape up. So you can take the whole of those possibilities into account, not just a single central case. And from the sort of academic sector, the National Institute of Economic and Social Research probably produces some of the most widely read forecasts of the UK. And they have one of the main models for forecasting the global economy as well. So they would be one of the main sources to look at. But I think the real point is that anybody who says they think they know exactly what's going to happen is either not very clever or they're lying. The whole point here is the uncertainty has gone up enormously. And that's what we should be focused on. And we need to think of policies which are robust to those uncertainties and the possibilities, and not just dependent on a single possible projected outcome.
Paul, I want to strong support your just last statement, which is this issue that when looking at the future or forecast for the economy, we need to take into account that is highly uncertainty. And more important, it's important that we try to measure this uncertainty. In that sense, it's good that he talked about the monetary policy reports or that the Bank of England do, because in their reports, normally when they have the forecast for the economy, they do have bands around the forecast where they try to assess the uncertainty. Actually, one of the issues they have done is that in the last year or so, they changed from predictions for output growth to predictions of the level of output. So it's easier to see this whole, are we back to the same level of output we have before the COVID hits the economy or not. But at the same time, they all have the bands. And one thing they do really well when discussing the report, and actually when trying to convey this information on the uncertainty on the forecast, is that they discuss the balance of risks, which means that they try to discuss whether there are reasons to think that the most likely path of the economy is being pushed out for risk that will push out the values down or upwards. So I'm sure they will have discussions about inflation risks, for example, possibly affecting forecasts.
Okay, well, thank you so much, Ana. Thank you, Paul. That's all for today's episode of this podcast. Thanks to my guest, Ana Galvao, Professor of Economic Modelling and Forecasting here at Warwick Business School, and Paul Fisher, Visiting Professor at Warwick Business School and former member of the Bank of England's Monetary Policy Committee. Thank you for joining me. I'll be back again with another episode of the Core Insights podcast. For now, stay safe and goodbye.